This is Danny Flexen here for Seconds Out. Delighted to be joined by Adam Morallee from ZHANG Boxing. Adam, how you doing?
Yeah, good, Danny. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Big news this week, of course, was that Joe Joyce and his team, of which you are a part, decided to exercise the rematch clause to take on Zhilei Zhang once again. Now, there's been a lot of talk this week, predominantly about Fabio Wardley, Fraser Clark, and promoters perhaps not having the same intentions as a management team regarding the fighter. I'm guessing with this and Joe, you all have to be on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. Zhilei Zhang's signed up with Queensberry now. So Queensberry have to be on the same page as this, but as part of the deal for Joe to fight Zhang, we made sure there was a rematch clause in there and that Joe could fight Zhang in either of Zhang's subsequent two bouts. So we've chosen the next bout and exercised the right.
And just explain to people, why is that? Why not take a fight in the interim or let Zhang have a fight in the interim? Is it the kind of mandatory being called by the end of the year? Does that put a bit of urgency on it?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things. One, obviously, as the holder of the WBO interim belt, you are in the mandatory position, and when that gets called, you need to be holding the belt at that time. Our best estimate is that's going to be kind of Q4, late Q4 this year, Q1 next year. We've got to get on with that. Number two, you never know what happens on an interim fight. One of the difficult things with boxing agreements is if you let Zhang take another fight, let's say he doesn't fight Fury, but he fights someone else, and then he loses to that person. Can we enforce our rights against that person? The belt has then gone to a different third person that we may not be able to get it off. But we did think about, we spoke with Joe about potentially taking an interim fight. Sometimes when you come off a loss, you want something to build your confidence back up. But Joe doesn't feel he needs that. We understand what happened in the fight, and Joe just wants to go straight back in.
Now, I'm not going to pull any punches, appropriate boxing metaphor there. It was a pretty conclusive defeat for Joe in the first fight. Obviously, the eye injury didn't help, but we've got to, accept that the eye injury was caused by punches from Zhang.
Yeah.
And there seems to be an issue, particularly with Joe getting out of the way of his southpaw left hand.
Yeah.
What, in the short space of time, what will change or what can change?
But when you suffer a loss like this, you have different ways you can look at it, and you can blame everybody and blame loads of external factors for why it went wrong, or you can look internally and try and figure out as a team what we did right, what we did wrong. I had a fairly good camp, actually. I'm not going to sit here and say there was injuries or anything like that. We had a fairly good camp. I think we've got to take all the individual parts, strength and conditioning we look at, coaching we look at, camp itself we look at, and not necessarily go back to the drawing board, because I think there were a lot of things that went very well, but clearly didn't go well in the ring, wasn't what we wanted. I don't think Joe would say it was, Joe's not happy with his performance, but we know what we're expecting next time. And I think I said this a lot in the lead up to the fight. It was going to be a bit of a cliche. It was going to be a fight of two halves. And I think everyone was saying that it was going to be Zhang early or Joe would stop him late. And you've seen from some of Joe's performances in the past, probably Carlos Takam in particular, where he's probably lost a few of the first, say, 5 rounds. But then in the second half of the fight, he comes into his own. And I think, Joe was losing the fight, in my book, at the time of the stoppage. I don't think he certainly wasn't 5-0 down. I had him 3-2 down. But I think he would have come into the fight. If that fight had gone 12 rounds, Joe Joyce would have won it. So lots to work on for the rematch. But yeah, look, he lost. You've got to take the L sometimes.
I mean, clearly, if that strategy is going to be successful second time around, Joe needs to avoid the level of punishment that caused the fight to be stopped. How does he do that? What adjustments? I know you're not the coach, but what adjustments do you guys as a team feel need to be made?
I mean, look, in very general terms, you either make specific defensive adjustments or you change your game plan slightly. I mean, if you look at, I know the punch stats aren't definitive, but Joe was throwing about 40, 50 punches around to start with. And in the 5th round, he threw 120 punches, I think. Whereas Zhang started off about 40 and was down to about 25. And I think he was going one way and Joe was going the other. Sure. So I think if that had carried on, Joe would have overwhelmed him. But in the first 6 rounds, yeah, we absolutely need to look at it and think about whether Joe's different offensively or defensively.
And one thing I wanted to ask, and I asked Shane Watson about this not long after the fight took place. In the corner, there seems to be kind of alternating voices. So not everyone talking at once, which is a good thing, obviously, but it seems to be Jimmy Tibbs was kind of the main one talking at one point. Then it was Salas. Then it was Steve Broughton. Was that kind of intentional, or was it kind of looking for answers?
Yeah, look, I think sometimes in a corner, you have a crowded corner with lots of different voices. I've seen that with a lot of the boxers I manage. Actually, in Joe's corner, it's pretty clean. It's really the only 2 voices that are really heard are Steve Broughton and Salas's voice. And Salas and Steve work together really, really well. I think Salas speaks in a way that Joe understands and gives him very kind of limited instructions in the corner if he wants to change things, which we didn't. So it's really just Salas and Steve who talk. But Joe's corner is one of the cleanest corners around. Everybody knows exactly what they're doing. Then you don't get conflicting instructions. We're really happy with that.
And what about Joe's mindset? First defeat, of course, as a professional. You've spoken to him presumably many times since that. Not just how confident is he going into the rematch, but how aware is he of what he needs to fix going into the rematch?
Yeah, very aware. I mean, Joe knows when to switch on in his career and knows when he has to take a step up. He's done that at different points of his amateur career. I think before the Dubois fight, people questioned whether or not Joe Joyce could change his game to fight Dubois. And I think Joe's a very, very dangerous underdog. I think Joe will probably go into the Zhang fight, even though he came into it like 8-1 on favourite or something. He'll come into the rematch probably as the underdog. I think Joe's a very dangerous underdog. He knows exactly what he has to do. He's good. He's really good. I mean, it took him a little while. It took all of us as a team a while to process the defeat. Straight to hospital to check if he's got any broken bones. Fortunately, nothing was broken. You've got to get over the pain of losing. And I think losing in boxing, when you lose in a way where, if you lose in football, you've got next week to put it right. When you lose in boxing, you've got probably 3 or 4 days of punishment that Joe took from different people, different commentators, different people telling him he should retire, he's useless, he doesn't move his head, all these things, which I think you've got to be strong inside, have a strong team around you and really know your strengths and weaknesses. And then once you've got past that initial 3 or 4 days, I think it's time to really go into what went right and what went wrong and face up to what went wrong and make those changes, however hard they have to be. So he's in a great place. I saw him yesterday. He's really pumped for the rematch. He loves having something to focus on and putting right what went wrong.
And you alluded there to the kind of backlash that's taken place since the defeat. Reminded me very much of when Dillian Whyte lost to Alexander Povetkin, in that Joe's been at the top level for a long time. He's been beating really good fighters, Joseph Parker among them. And then one defeat, and everyone's like, well, we always knew he was bad, all along. We knew this was going to happen and stuff. How have you as a team dealt with that?
Look, I think it wasn't as though Joe lost a close decision of the fight. And when you lose a close decision, you can, not say blame it on other people, but say that was an unfair decision. Joe lost, as you said, quite conclusively. So as a team, we've had to go into everything that happened and be ruthless and look at what was good and what was not so good. So Joe did lose conclusively, decisively. But as I said before, if that fight had gone on into later rounds, I think Joe would have been successful in the fight. So he did a lot of things well in that fight, but he also did a lot of things not great. But he didn't get knocked out. He didn't get dropped. His chin didn't crack. And there are a lot of people, I mean, you've got to remember at the start of Joe's career, probably until, even when he was fighting people like Bermain Stiverne and Ustinov and he beat Lemroy Thomas, people were still saying he's slow and he's no good. It really was only after the Parker fight where Joe really started to get appreciated by most people in boxing. But still, where was that underlying feeling of, well, he's a bit slow, he defends punches with his face. And then when something like that happens, everyone's like, I was right. I told you for years. I've watched him for years. He was this, he was that. And the truth about Joe is he has incredible qualities that will take him all the way to a world title. He didn't have a great day at the office. But for him to lose that fight, a lot of things had to go wrong at the same time, and they happened to. It allows us as a team to interrogate the performance more and make more adjustments. Had Joe, for example, had the eye swelling not been as bad and had the fight not been pulled off on the eye swelling, he would have probably won, maybe late, maybe a decision. And maybe as a team, we wouldn't have made the changes. It's another win. It's another win. And Joe Joyce wasn't great early on, but came through and showed his true character and won at the end. You know, that could be a completely different story, all by the base of how much he's swelled up in his eye. So I think we've got to utilise the loss to our benefit and interrogate what went wrong.
In the build-up, there was a lot of talk about Anthony Joshua and Joe potentially fighting him, to the point where towards the end of fight week, Joe just didn't want to talk about that anymore, understandably. Yeah. Did that play into his mindset going into the fight at all? Was there, not distracted, but was he kind of frustrated by the focus on someone who wasn't the man in front of him?
No, not at all. I mean, we look after a lot of fighters, and I can tell you out of all of them, Joe's the most focused and really doesn't care what is going on pretty much outside his bedroom. He's just completely focused on whatever he's doing in that moment, and that's what makes him so elite, really. I think if you remember AJ Franklin fight week, they were talking about Joe a lot. And it was natural in the media to talk that fight up, to talk up AJ, Joe Joyce. But yeah, Joe was certainly not distracted by that. I mean, it's good that Joe's name's been mentioned in those conversations. But yeah, he wasn't distracted at all. He was focused on the fight. And, you know, if Joe thinks about anything coming up to a fight, it's about how he's feeling, his opponent. So he never gets distracted by anything like that.
Now, obviously, you have to focus as a team on the positives and, you know, winning the rematch. But as his manager, there's also got to be a contingency plan. If, God forbid, he were to lose successive fights to Zhilei Zhang, what is the future? What does the future look like for Joe Joyce?
I think as a management team, when we look at Joe, you start off with your goals. And what are our goals for Joe? He wants to be a world champion. He wants to achieve that. That's important. He wants to be financially secure and independent when he finishes boxing. And in order to do that in the heavyweight division, I think is slightly different to other divisions. You've got to be a name. You've got to be well known. You've got to be, and Derek Chisora's shown everybody how being well known and a character will lead you to financial success, even in the face of defeats. Now, what Queensberry and BT Sport have done brilliantly with Joe is pushed him to a level now where he's becoming a name with some level of casual recognition. The viewing figures for that fight were really good. BT, Queensberry, really happy with the viewing figures for that fight. And Joe's starting to cut through into the public's kind of awareness. And look, it would be devastating if Joe was to lose the rematch, but he still remains at that point a named heavyweight. He's not where we want him to be. He's not at the category A Usyk Fury heavyweight. If he loses twice, you've got to be honest, he's not at that level. But, you know, he becomes a category B heavyweight, I guess, and fights against people like Dillian White certainly are very possible at that level. But would Joe get another world title shot again? Be really challenging, I think, for Joe to get another world title shot. Not impossible. Not impossible. I mean, he could. There are still very interesting fights for a name like Joe Joyce out there, particularly. I mean, even if Joe lost twice, I think people would still want to see Joe Joyce, Deontay Wilder, just for the clash of those styles, best chin against the biggest puncher. So I think Joe's marketability has increased to a level where he can withstand 2 losses and still have major fights, even though he probably won't be fighting for world titles unless we get really lucky.
Just before I let you go, I saw a tweet from Larone Richards, I think it was yesterday, saying he's out very soon, but after that there's big news coming. Can you give us any sort of hint of what that might be, what the future holds for Larone?
Yeah, look, Larone's boxing on Friday in a show on Boxing Social. Thanks to those guys for putting Larone on. And yeah, we have got something planned for Larone later in the summer. Can't quite talk about it now, but he's going to be campaigning at 168. But then I think I'd like Larone, and I think Larone would like to move up to 175, because I think there's absolutely brilliant fights out there for him in the domestic scene at the moment. Callum Smith, Buatsi, Anthony Yard, all those guys. And I think Larone's a brilliant addition to that level of 175 fighters. So I'd love to see him campaign at that later in the year.
Great stuff. Adam, always a pleasure. I wish you obviously the very best of luck for the rematch. Big fans of Joe
Cheers,
here at Seconds Out. So fingers crossed, gets the job done.